Marcus Chen had everything money could buy, yet he sat alone in his penthouse overlooking downtown Seattle, scrolling through dating apps with growing disgust. At 34, the tech mogul had built a fortune from his AI software company, but every woman who matched with him seemed to have dollar signs in her eyes the moment they discovered his net worth. He'd grown tired of the same pattern. Initial attraction, followed by sudden interest in his lifestyle, expensive dates, and relationships that felt more like business transactions than genuine connections. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. That's when the idea struck him during a late-night conversation with his business partner, Jake Morrison. What if he could use his own artificial intelligence technology to create the perfect test? What if he could strip away all the superficial layers and discover if anyone could truly see through to the real person beneath? Marcus spent 3 weeks developing what he privately called Project Mirror. Using his company's most advanced AI algorithms, he created sophisticated fake dating profiles that would be virtually indistinguishable from real people. But these weren't just simple catfish accounts. Each profile was powered by machine learning that could adapt conversations in real time, analyze personality patterns, and respond with human-like authenticity. The profiles he created were deliberately unremarkable. There was David Rodriguez, a struggling mechanic from Portland who lived in a studio apartment and drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic. Kevin Thompson worked night shifts at a warehouse in Tacoma and was saving up to take community college classes. Brian Walsh was an unemployed graphic designer trying to freelance while living with 3 roommates in Bellingham. Each fake persona came complete with carefully crafted backstories, financial struggles, and modest dreams. Marcus had his AI generate months of fake social media history, complete with photos of average-looking men he'd hired as models, never knowing their images would be used in this elaborate social experiment. The parameters were simple but revealing. The AI would engage with women on various dating platforms, presenting these working-class personas authentically. Marcus programmed specific responses for when conversations turned to money, career ambitions, or lifestyle preferences. David would mention picking up extra shifts to afford a night out. Kevin would talk about clipping coupons and shopping at thrift stores. Brian would discuss the stress of uncertain income and dreams of one day affording his own apartment. Marcus monitored every conversation from his downtown office, watching as the AI versions of these fictional men interacted with dozens of women across Washington state. The technology was so sophisticated that it could maintain multiple simultaneous conversations while keeping each persona's story consistent and believable. Within the first week, the results were exactly what Marcus had expected, and it filled him with a familiar disappointment. Most conversations died quickly once the women realized they weren't talking to men with substantial incomes. David's matches dropped off when he mentioned needing to save up for car repairs. Kevin's conversations went cold after he suggested coffee dates instead of expensive restaurants. Brian faced rejection after rejection when potential dates learned about his living situation. The pattern was depressingly consistent. Women would show initial interest based on photos and basic compatibility, but the moment financial limitations entered the conversation, enthusiasm would wane. Some would direct about it, others simply ghosted. But the message was clear. In the modern dating world, financial stability wasn't just preferred, it was often considered mandatory. Marcus found himself working late into the night, analyzing conversation logs and emotional response patterns. His AI was learning from each interaction, becoming more sophisticated in its ability to gauge genuine interest versus superficial attraction. The technology mapped out behavioral patterns, noting how quickly conversations shifted when topics turned to money, career prospects, or future plans. But then, on a rainy Thursday evening in November, something unexpected happened. A 27-year-old elementary school teacher named Sarah Mitchell from Spokane matched with Brian Walsh. Her profile was refreshingly honest. She taught 3rd grade, loved hiking, and was looking for someone who shared her values rather than her lifestyle ambitions. The conversation started normally enough. Sarah asked about Brian's graphic design work, and the AI responded with programmed details about struggling to find consistent clients and working odd jobs to make ends meet. Instead of the usual silence that followed such admissions, Sarah's response surprised Marcus. "That sounds really challenging," she wrote. "I have so much respect for creative people trying to make it work. Teaching doesn't pay much either, but I love what I do. Maybe we're both a little crazy for choosing passion over paychecks." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, studying the screen intently. This was different. Sarah didn't seem fazed by Brian's financial struggles. If anything, she seemed more interested. The AI continued the conversation, mentioning Brian's cramped living situation and uncertainty about the future. "I get it," Sarah replied. "I'm still paying off student loans and living in a tiny apartment I can barely afford. But you know what? Some of my happiest memories are from when I had even less. Money doesn't create the moments that matter." Over the following days, Marcus watched their conversations with growing fascination. Sarah never asked about Brian's income potential or career advancement opportunities. Instead, she wanted to know about his creative process, his inspirations, his dreams beyond financial success. When Brian mentioned feeling embarrassed about suggesting inexpensive date ideas, Sarah responded with genuine enthusiasm. "Are you kidding? I'd much rather go for a hike or visit a free museum than sit in some overpriced restaurant making small talk. The best conversations happen when you're not worried about impressing anyone." Marcus found himself staying late at the office, not to monitor the broader experiment, but to follow this single conversation thread. Sarah's responses were unlike anything he'd programmed the AI to expect. She seemed to see through the financial circumstances to something deeper, something the AI was inadvertently revealing about the kind of person Marcus had always hoped to be. But as he watched their connection deepen through screens and algorithms, Marcus began to feel an uncomfortable knot forming in his stomach. This woman was falling for someone who didn't exist, someone who was nothing more than carefully crafted code and fabricated stories. And worse yet, Marcus was beginning to realize that through his artificial creation, he was experiencing the kind of genuine connection he'd been searching for his entire adult life. The irony wasn't lost on him. In creating the perfect test to expose superficial intentions, he'd found someone who seemed to care about everything except the superficial. But she was caring about a lie, a digital phantom that existed only in his computer servers. As Sarah's messages became more personal and her interest more evident, Marcus faced an ethical dilemma he hadn't anticipated when designing his experiment. The AI was scheduled to reveal inconsistencies that would expose the fake profiles, but Marcus found himself hesitating to execute that part of the program. For the first time in years, he'd found someone who seemed to understand what he'd always believed about love and connection. The problem was, she thought she was talking to someone else entirely. Sarah's messages arrived with increasing frequency, each one pulling Marcus deeper into an emotional labyrinth he hadn't anticipated. While his other AI personas continued their predictable interactions with diminishing matches, Brian Walsh's conversations with Sarah had evolved into something that felt startlingly real. "I keep thinking about what you said yesterday," Sarah wrote on a Friday morning, "about how creativity comes from struggle sometimes. I see that with my students, too. The ones who face challenges at home often show the most imagination in their writing." Marcus stared at the message, realizing the AI had somehow captured a philosophical depth he'd never programmed into it. The machine learning algorithms were adapting not just to Sarah's responses, but evolving the persona based on their ongoing dialogue. Brian Walsh was becoming more human with each exchange, developing nuances and emotional intelligence that surprised even his creator. The conversation had moved beyond the dating app to text messaging, a development that required Marcus to manually intervene more frequently. The AI could handle complex conversations, but direct phone communication needed his personal oversight. He found himself crafting responses that felt increasingly personal, as if he were speaking through Brian's digital mask to express thoughts and feelings he'd never been able to share under his own identity. Sarah suggested meeting for coffee at a small cafe in Spokane called The Daily Grind. The request sent panic through Marcus's carefully constructed experiment. His AI profiles were designed for digital interaction only. There was no actual Brian Walsh to show up for a coffee date. He needed to buy time while figuring out how to handle this complication without destroying the connection they'd built. "I'd love to meet," he typed back through Brian's profile, "but I'm dealing with some family issues right now that might keep me busy for a few weeks. My grandmother in Oregon isn't doing well, and I might need to help out there." The lie came easily, another layer of deception added to an already complex web. But Sarah's response revealed the depth of her character in a way that made Marcus's chest tighten with guilt. "I'm so sorry to hear about your grandmother. Family comes first, always. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready, and if you need someone to talk to about what you're going through, I'm a pretty good listener." Marcus leaned back in his office chair, surrounded by monitors displaying analytics from his broader experiment. The other AI profiles were generating exactly the data he'd expected, clear evidence that most people prioritized financial stability over genuine compatibility. But Sarah's responses were creating an entirely different dataset, one that challenged every cynical assumption he'd made about modern dating. Over the weekend, Marcus made a decision that would complicate his experiment exponentially. Instead of maintaining the scheduled distance, he decided to deepen Brian's interactions with Sarah. He wanted to understand what made her different, what allowed her to see past surface-level concerns that seemed to drive everyone else. Their conversations began exploring territory that Marcus had never navigated in his real relationships. Sarah shared stories about her challenging students, the ones from broken homes who acted out in class but showed glimpses of brilliance. She talked about her own financial struggles with an honesty that was both refreshing and heartbreaking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Sometimes I have to choose between buying groceries and getting my car repaired," she wrote. "But you know what's funny? Those weeks when I'm eating ramen and peanut butter sandwiches, I often feel more grateful for small things. Like when a student finally grasps a concept they've been struggling with, or when I find a $5 bill in an old jacket pocket." Marcus found himself responding with equal vulnerability, sharing Brian's fictional struggles in ways that reflected his own emotional experiences. The poverty was fabricated, but the feelings of isolation, the search for authentic connection, the fear of being valued for the wrong reasons, those emotions were entirely genuine. "I think about that a lot," he wrote back, "how success and happiness aren't the same thing. I see people around me who seem to have everything figured out financially, but they look miserable. Sometimes I wonder if we're the lucky ones, getting to focus on what actually matters." The irony of his words wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a millionaire pretending to be broke, discussing the meaninglessness of wealth with someone who embodied the values he'd always claimed to cherish but had never encountered in his actual dating life. Sarah's next message arrived with a photo attachment, a picture of her classroom decorated for Thanksgiving, with construction paper turkeys and handwritten gratitude lists from her students. The image showed a space that was clearly underfunded but overflowing with creativity and care. "This is my world," she wrote. 28 kids who teach me something new every day. Look at what they wrote they're thankful for. Family, friends, pets, favorite foods. Not one of them mentioned money or things. We could learn from them." Marcus studied the photo for a long time, zooming in on the children's handwriting, their innocent expressions of gratitude. He thought about his own penthouse, filled with expensive art and cutting-edge technology, yet feeling emptier than this modest classroom bursting with authentic joy. That evening, Marcus walked through his upscale Belltown neighborhood, passing restaurants where he'd taken countless dates, each meal costing more than Sarah probably spent on groceries in a week. The conversations in those restaurants had been predictable, discussions about travel destinations, career advancement, luxury purchases. None of his real-life dates had ever shown him pictures of their work, with the pride and passion Sarah displayed. Back in his office on Monday morning, Marcus discovered that Sarah had been researching Brian's supposed situation. She'd sent links to resources for struggling artists, information about grants and community programs, even details about food banks and assistance programs in Bellingham. "I hope you don't mind me looking into this stuff," she wrote. "I know pride can make it hard to ask for help, but there are people who want to support creative individuals like you. You have too much talent to let financial stress crush your dreams." The message hit Marcus like a physical blow. While he'd been testing her authenticity, she'd been trying to genuinely help someone she believed was struggling. Her concern wasn't theoretical or performative. She'd spent her own time researching practical solutions for problems she thought Brian was facing. Marcus realized his experiment had revealed something he hadn't anticipated discovering. Sarah wasn't just different from the other women he'd encountered. She represented a type of person he'd convinced himself didn't exist in his world. Someone who led with empathy instead of ambition, who measured success by impact rather than income, who saw potential in people regardless of their economic circumstances. But this revelation came with a devastating cost. The deeper their connection grew, the more elaborate his deception became. He was falling for someone who was falling for a fiction, and every day the lie continued made the eventual truth more potentially destructive. As Sarah's messages became more personal and their bond stronger, Marcus faced a reality he'd never anticipated when designing his experiment. He'd created the perfect test to identify genuine people, but in doing so, he'd trapped himself in a situation where his own genuineness was impossible to reveal, without destroying exactly what he'd been searching for his entire life. 3 weeks into December, Marcus's carefully constructed digital world began showing cracks he couldn't ignore. Sarah had started asking specific questions about Brian's life that required increasingly elaborate fabrications. She wanted to know about his childhood, his family, his friends, details that the AI couldn't generate convincingly because they required emotional depth that only lived experience could provide. "Tell me about your best friend," Sarah had written. "I feel like you can learn so much about someone by hearing about the people they choose to keep close." Marcus spent an hour crafting a response about a fictional childhood friend named Tommy, weaving together memories from his own past but transplanting them into Brian's working-class narrative. The process felt like surgery performed on his own history, cutting away the wealth and privilege to leave only the emotional core. Meanwhile, his original experiment was yielding exactly the data he'd predicted. The analytics showed a clear pattern. Conversations decreased by an average of 73% once financial limitations were revealed. Women who'd initially shown interest in David, Kevin, and the other personas quickly moved on to matches with better financial prospects. Marcus had proven his hypothesis about modern dating priorities, but the victory felt hollow against the backdrop of his evolving relationship with Sarah. Jake Morrison had started asking questions about Marcus's distracted behavior during board meetings. The company was launching a new AI platform, but Marcus found himself checking his phone constantly for Sarah's messages instead of focusing on business presentations that would typically command his complete attention. "You're different lately," Jake observed during a private conversation in Marcus's office. "More distant, but also somehow more present? I can't explain it." Marcus couldn't explain it either. Through Brian Walsh, he was experiencing emotions he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. Sarah's messages had become the highlight of his days, not because of their romantic potential, but because of their genuine human warmth. She shared stories about her students' progress, sent photos of sunsets during her evening walks, asked thoughtful questions about his supposed art projects. The AI had evolved beyond Marcus's original programming, learning from Sarah's communication style to develop responses that felt increasingly authentic. But Marcus found himself manually overriding the AI more frequently, wanting to respond to Sarah with his own thoughts rather than algorithmic approximations. One evening, Sarah sent a message that stopped Marcus cold. "I've been thinking about something. Would you be interested in doing a video call this weekend? I know we've been texting for weeks, and I'd love to actually see your face when we talk. No pressure if you're not ready. I just feel like we have this amazing connection, and I'm curious about the person behind these thoughtful messages." Marcus stared at the screen, his hands frozen over the keyboard. This was the moment he'd been dreading and somehow hoping for simultaneously. There was no AI sophisticated enough to handle a live video conversation, no way to maintain the Brian Walsh fiction in real-time visual interaction. His first instinct was to create another excuse, perhaps claim his camera was broken or suggest they wait until after the holidays. But something in Sarah's message, the careful balance of interest and respect for boundaries, made him realize how fundamentally dishonest his entire experiment had become. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked through his penthouse, looking out at the Seattle skyline, thinking about Sarah grading papers in her modest apartment 280 miles away. She believed she was building a relationship with a struggling artist who shared her values about what mattered in life. Instead, she was connecting with a wealthy tech executive who'd built his fortune on the very technologies that were increasingly dominating human interaction. The next morning brought another complication. Sarah had sent a package to the address Marcus had given for Brian's fictional Bellingham apartment, a P.O. box he'd set up to maintain the charade. Inside was a carefully wrapped Christmas gift, a set of professional-grade colored pencils, with a note that read, "I noticed you mentioned wanting to try different mediums for your art, but not being able to afford good supplies. These are from my favorite art store. I saved up for them because I believe in your talent." Marcus held the expensive pencils, realizing they probably represented a significant purchase for someone on a teacher's salary. Sarah had sacrificed her own limited resources to support Brian's fictional artistic dreams. The gesture was so genuine, so thoughtful, that Marcus felt physically sick about his deception. He spent the afternoon researching Sarah's school, Lincoln Elementary in Spokane. The website showed a cheerful but clearly underfunded institution. Sarah's classroom page featured photos of projects her students had completed, along with a wish list of supplies she hoped to acquire for future lessons. The list included basic items like construction paper, glue sticks, and books, things that cost less than Marcus's typical lunch. That evening, an anonymous donation of $5,000 appeared in Lincoln Elementary's fund, specifically designated for Sarah Mitchell's classroom supplies. Marcus told himself it was a small gesture of appreciation for her kindness to Brian, but he knew it was really an attempt to ease his guilty conscience. Sarah's next message arrived with excitement about her school receiving an unexpected donation. "Can you believe it? Someone donated enough money to get everything on my wish list and more. My kids are going to have such an amazing second semester. I keep thinking about what kind of person just gives like that, expecting nothing in return. It makes me feel hopeful about the world." Marcus realized his anonymous gift had only deepened his deception. Sarah was attributing the donation to the goodness of humanity, while simultaneously caring for someone who was lying to her about his most basic circumstances. The video call request remained unanswered, hanging between them like a bridge Marcus couldn't cross without revealing everything. Sarah had followed up once, gently asking if everything was okay, but she hadn't pressed the issue. Her patience and understanding only amplified Marcus's guilt. On December 23rd, Sarah sent what would become the message that changed everything. "Brian, I hope you don't think I'm being too forward, but I've been thinking a lot about our conversations over these past months. I feel like I know you in a way that's rare and special. Whatever challenges you're facing with money or career uncertainty, I want you to know that none of that matters to me. What matters is how you think, how you care about things, how you make me laugh and make me want to be a better person. I'm falling for who you are, not what you have or don't have." Marcus read the message 3 times, each reading making his chest tighten further. Sarah had just declared her feelings for someone who didn't exist, someone who was nothing more than an elaborate digital construction built on lies and algorithms. For the first time since beginning his experiment, Marcus considered what he'd actually accomplished. He'd proven that most people prioritized financial security in relationships, but he'd also discovered someone who genuinely didn't. He'd found exactly what he'd always claimed to want, but he'd found it through deception so complete that revealing the truth would destroy the very thing he'd discovered. As he sat in his expensive office, surrounded by the technology that had made him wealthy, Marcus realized his greatest creation wasn't his AI platform or his business empire. It was Brian Walsh, a fictional person who'd somehow become more real to him than his actual identity. Christmas Eve arrived with a message from Sarah that shattered Marcus's remaining composure. "I know this might sound crazy, but I've decided to drive to Bellingham tomorrow. I want to surprise you for Christmas. I've been saving up for months to afford the gas in a small hotel room. I can't stop thinking about what you said in your last message about feeling alone during the holidays. Nobody should be alone on Christmas, especially someone as wonderful as you." Marcus's hands trembled as he read her words. Sarah was planning to drive 5 hours to spend Christmas with someone who didn't exist, using money she'd saved from her teacher's salary. The elaborate digital construction he'd built was about to collide with physical reality in a way that would devastate the most genuine person he'd ever encountered. He had less than 24 hours to make a decision that would determine the course of both their lives. Marcus spent Christmas Eve pacing his penthouse, drafting and deleting dozens of messages. He could create another excuse, another fictional emergency that would prevent the meeting. But the thought of Sarah spending her saved money on a hotel room in Bellingham, waiting for someone who would never arrive, made him physically ill. At 2 a.m. on Christmas morning, Marcus made a choice that terrified him more than any business decision he'd ever faced. He would tell Sarah the truth, not through Brian's profile, but in person. If she was willing to drive 5 hours to meet a struggling artist, perhaps she deserved to hear the real story from the man who'd created him. Marcus canceled Sarah's trip with a message from Brian explaining a sudden family emergency, but he included something new. "There's something important I need to tell you, something I should have said months ago. Can we meet at Pike Place Market in Seattle instead? I'll be at the flower vendors at 3 p.m. on December 26th. I'll be wearing a blue jacket and carrying a copy of The Great Gatsby. What I have to tell you will change everything, but you deserve to hear the truth. Sarah's response came quickly. Of course. Whatever you need to tell me, we'll figure it out together. I'll be there. December 26th dawned gray and drizzly, typical Seattle winter weather. Marcus arrived at Pike Place Market an hour early, positioning himself near the flower vendors as he'd promised. He'd chosen the location carefully, public enough to feel safe for Sarah, but with enough ambient noise to provide privacy for a conversation that would either begin something real or end everything they'd built. At exactly 3 p.m., Marcus saw her walking through the market crowd. Sarah looked exactly like her photos, but somehow more vibrant in person. She moved with purpose, scanning faces, clearly nervous but determined. She wore a red coat that looked well cared for but not expensive, and she clutched her phone, probably checking Brian's description one more time. Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding harder than it had during any business presentation or investor meeting. Sarah? She turned, and her expression shifted from expectation to confusion. I'm sorry, I think there's been a mistake. I'm meeting someone here. You're meeting Brian Walsh, Marcus said quietly. I'm Brian Walsh, but I'm also someone else entirely, and that's what I need to explain. Sarah's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition of some impossible possibility, then a dawning realization that something was very wrong. I don't understand. Marcus gestured toward a nearby cafe. Could we sit down? What I have to tell you is complicated, and you're gonna hate me for it. But you deserve to know the truth. They found a corner table in a small coffee shop overlooking Elliott Bay. Sarah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, waiting for an explanation that Marcus wasn't sure he could deliver without destroying everything. My name is Marcus Chen, he began. I'm not a struggling artist. I'm not from Bellingham. I don't live with roommates or worry about paying rent. I created Brian Walsh as part of an experiment to test whether anyone could see past financial circumstances to connect with a person authentically. Sarah's face went pale. An experiment? Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her the analytics dashboard from his dating experiment. I created multiple I powered fake profiles of men with financial struggles. I wanted to prove that modern dating was purely transactional, that people only cared about money and status. So Brian Walsh doesn't exist, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Not in the way you think. But the conversations we had, the thoughts and feelings I shared through his profile, those were real. The AI generated some responses, but increasingly, I was writing to you directly. Everything Brian told you about creativity, about what matters in life, about finding meaning beyond financial success, those were my actual thoughts. Sarah stared at him, processing information that must have felt like learning that gravity worked differently than she'd always believed. You lied to me for months. Yes. You made me fall in love with someone who doesn't exist. The person you fell in love with does exist, Marcus said desperately. He's sitting right here. I know how this looks, I know how manipulative and cruel it seems, but the connection we built was real. The feelings were real. Sarah stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. The feelings were based on lies. You made me believe I was helping someone who was struggling. Made me spend money I don't have on gifts for someone who didn't need them. Made me drive here to meet someone who was never real. Sarah, please. Do you have any idea what it feels like to discover that your judgment is so flawed that you can fall in love with a computer program? Her voice cracked. I pride myself on seeing the good in people, on being able to look past surface things. And you used that against me. Marcus reached across the table, but Sarah pulled back. I know how it looks. I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. But what we built together taught me something I never expected to learn. You're everything I always claimed to want, but never thought I'd find. You're genuine, compassionate, real in ways that no one in my actual life has ever been. Your actual life, Sarah repeated bitterly. The life where you're a millionaire who creates fake people to manipulate women online. I created the experiment because I was cynical about dating, because everyone I met seemed interested in my money rather than who I am as a person. But you proved me wrong. You saw through all the superficial things to something deeper. I saw through a lie. Sarah's voice rose, drawing looks from other cafe patrons. Everything I thought I knew about Brian, everything I felt for him, was based on fiction. How is that proving anything except how gullible I am? Marcus felt the weight of his actions settling on him like physical pressure. You're not gullible. You're exactly what you appear to be. Someone who cares about people's hearts instead of their bank accounts. I've spent months watching other women in my experiment lose interest the moment they learned about financial limitations. But you did the opposite. You offered help, support, and genuine care. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. So this is all just data to you? My feelings, my concern, my time, it's all just part of your experiment? No, Marcus said urgently. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being an experiment and became the most real relationship I've ever had. I've never connected with anyone the way I connected with you through those conversations. Through lies, Sarah corrected. Through a medium that let me be honest about things I've never been able to say as myself. When Brian talked about feeling isolated despite being surrounded by people. That was me. When he said he wondered if success and happiness were different things, those were my actual thoughts. Sarah sat back down, but her posture remained defensive. Why are you telling me this now? Why not just let Brian disappear and keep your experiment data? Marcus had prepared for this question, but the answer still felt inadequate. Because you were planning to spend your Christmas break, and you saved money to visit someone who doesn't exist. Because you've been nothing but genuine with me, and you deserved the same in return. And because I'm hoping that maybe, somehow, you might be willing to get to know the real person behind Brian Walsh. The real person is someone who lies to women online for fun. The real person is someone who's been so disappointed by superficial relationships that he convinced himself genuine people didn't exist. You proved me wrong, and I want to prove to you that the person you connected with through Brian's profile is who I really am underneath all the money and success. Sarah looked out the window at Elliott Bay, watching ferries move across the gray water. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter but still hurt. I need time to process this. I don't know how to separate the person I thought I knew from the person you actually are. Quote. Marcus nodded, understanding that this might be the last conversation they ever had. I know I have no right to ask for anything from you, but if you're willing, I'd like the chance to show you who I really am when I'm not hiding behind experimental profiles or AI algorithms. I'd like to earn your trust as myself. Sarah stood up again, gathering her purse and coat. I don't know if that's possible. Trust isn't something you can earn back after breaking it completely. I understand, Marcus said. But Sarah, before you leave, the person you thought you were falling for, the values and perspectives you connected with, those weren't fabricated by AI. They were me, trying to be honest in the only way I knew how. Sarah paused at the cafe door, looking back at him one final time. The saddest part is that if you'd just been yourself from the beginning, if you'd approached me honestly as Marcus Chen instead of creating this elaborate deception, I might have been interested anyway. My problem was never with wealthy people. It was with people who assume wealth is all I care about. She left, and Marcus sat alone in the cafe, staring at his reflection in the window. His experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, and failed more completely than he could have imagined. He'd proven that Sarah Mitchell was exactly the kind of person he'd always hoped to find, but he'd discovered it through methods that made building a real relationship with her nearly impossible. 6 months later, Marcus dissolved his dating experiment and donated the research to a university studying authentic human connection in digital spaces. He'd learned what he'd set out to discover, but the knowledge came with a cost he was still calculating. As for Sarah, she never responded to the emails he sent or answered the calls he made. The most genuine person he'd ever encountered had walked out of his life, taking with her the possibility of the authentic connection he'd spent a lifetime seeking. Marcus had used technology to find exactly what he was looking for, only to discover that some things, trust, love, genuine human connection, couldn't be engineered, programmed, or manipulated into existence. They could only be built through the simple, difficult act of being real with another person from the very beginning. The weeks following their meeting blurred together in a haze of regret and obsessive analysis. Marcus found himself checking Sarah's social media profiles daily, watching from a distance as she returned to her normal life. Her classroom updates showed the same enthusiasm for teaching, the same care for her students, But there was something different in her posts, a wariness that hadn't existed before. Marcus's business partner Jake noticed the dramatic shift in his behavior during their January board meeting. "You've been distracted for months, but now you look like someone died. What's going on?" For the first time since starting his company, Marcus considered telling someone the complete truth about his experiment. But explaining the depth of his deception, the months of lies, the genuine feelings he'd developed for someone who now despised him, it all seemed too pathetic to put into words. Instead, Marcus threw himself into work with manic intensity. He developed new AI algorithms, pursued aggressive expansion plans, and acquired 3 smaller tech companies in rapid succession. His employees whispered about his newfound ruthlessness in business dealings, his impatience with anything that didn't deliver immediate results. But success felt hollow in ways it never had before. Each milestone, each profitable quarter, each industry award only reminded him of what Sarah had said, that wealth and happiness weren't the same thing. He'd known this intellectually for years, had even built his experiment around proving it. But only now did he understand the difference viscerally. 3 months after their meeting, Marcus received notification that Lincoln Elementary was again seeking donations for classroom supplies. Sarah's wish list had been updated with new items needed for spring semester projects. Marcus stared at the modest requests: colored paper, science experiment materials, books for reluctant readers, and realized she was still doing the same work that had made him admire her in the first place. He made another anonymous donation, larger this time, but the gesture felt meaningless. Money was the easiest thing in the world for him to give, but it was also the most superficial. Sarah needed someone who could offer presence, authenticity, emotional availability, qualities that his wealth had somehow insulated him from developing. In April, Marcus encountered Sarah's former college roommate at a Seattle networking event. The woman, Lisa Chen, worked for a nonprofit organization and mentioned Sarah casually while discussing education funding. "She's doing amazing work with her kids," Lisa said. "Though she's been different lately. More guarded, I guess. She went through some kind of bad relationship situation over the holidays. Some guy who turned out to be completely different from what she thought." Marcus felt the weight of his impact on Sarah's life settling deeper into his conscience. He hadn't just lied to her. He'd changed her fundamental approach to trusting people. The openness and vulnerability that had drawn him to her were now compromised because of his actions. That evening, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. He wrote a detailed letter explaining not just what he'd done, but why he'd done it, what he'd learned from their interactions, and how meeting her had changed his understanding of himself. He didn't ask for forgiveness or another chance. He simply wanted her to know that their connection, however it had been established, had transformed him in ways that extended far beyond their digital relationship. The letter was 12 pages long, handwritten rather than typed, because somehow that felt more honest. Marcus mailed it to the school, unsure if Sarah would even read it, but needing to express thoughts he'd never been able to articulate during their brief meeting. Sarah never responded to the letter, but Marcus heard through Lisa that she'd received it. That knowledge had to be enough. By summer, Marcus had restructured his entire approach to both business and personal relationships. He sold his penthouse and moved to a modest apartment in Capitol Hill. He established a foundation focused on supporting underfunded schools, though he was careful to ensure Sarah's district received funding through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. The dating experiment data gathered dust in his computer files, never published or presented. The research that had once seemed so important now felt like evidence of his own emotional immaturity rather than insights into human nature. Marcus occasionally wondered if he would ever encounter another person like Sarah, someone who could see past circumstances to character. But he also recognized that such encounters required vulnerability on both sides, something his experiment had made impossible from the start. 1 year after their meeting, Marcus was volunteering at a community center in South Seattle when he overheard 2 teachers discussing classroom management strategies. One voice sounded familiar, and when he turned around, he saw Sarah helping to organize supplies for a summer reading program. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, neither moved. Sarah's expression was unreadable, not angry, but not welcoming either. Marcus nodded slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than greeting, and quietly left the building. Later that week, Marcus received a brief email from an address he didn't recognize. I read your letter. I understand why you did what you did, even if I can't forgive how you did it. I hope you've learned to be honest with people from the beginning. Some connections are worth the risk of rejection. It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't an opening for renewed contact. But it was closure, and perhaps more importantly, it was confirmation that the person he'd fallen for through digital deception was exactly who he'd believed her to be. Someone capable of wisdom and grace, even in the face of betrayal. Marcus kept the email but never responded to it. Some lessons, he'd finally learned, were best absorbed in silence. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.